Good morning. In this week's parsha of Emor, we have the laws of the sanctification of the Kohanim, that the Kohanim have a special status of holiness and extra restrictions on who they may marry, and in particular the one I'm going to focus on today is restrictions on their contact with the deceased. A Kohen is not allowed to have any kind of contact with the body of a deceased person except if it's one of his 7 close relatives, father, mother, brother, sister, wife, son, daughter. Those are the only funerals that he can really attend in which he can fully participate. All other times, a Kohen has to keep his distance from the deceased or from a grave, not even standing under a tree that also overshadows a grave. And similarly, at the funeral itself, if you've observed the way that the funeral structures are generally made, is you have 2 sections with, in fact, a gap in between them. You have a section where the body of the deceased is, and then a gap, and then the place where everyone stands, and that's so that Kohanim can stand there without being under the same roof as the deceased. Now, what's that all about? Why is it that Kohanim are not allowed to have this kind of contact with the deceased? So for years I've wondered about this, and just this week I have seen a marvelous explanation from Rav Kook. I saw it first quoted in this book, Gold from the Land of Israel, Rabbi Hanan Morrison taking extracts from the writings of Rav Kook. Rav Kook says this in his book Orot HaKodesh, Holy Lights, Volume 2, page 392, where he says, he doesn't quote this, but I'll start with the famous quote from Joseph Goebbels, Yamach Shemor, from the evil Nazi propagandist, who said one of the great principles of propaganda is that if you tell a big enough lie, often enough, people will eventually believe it. And this is the principle, Rav Kook says, of what applies to death. Death is actually a lie. Death is not true. What's the lie of death? The lie is that the person is not here anymore. The lie is that the person's gone. The lie is that the person has ended. It's not true. We know that the Torah tells us about, well, it's not explicitly in the Chumash, but we know that certainly a major component of Jewish thought is the immortality of the soul, is the fact that the soul lives on even after the body has returned to the earth. Their soul is immortal. The person does not end. In fact, the Gemara says, "Gedolim tzadikim b'mitatan yotem b'chayehem." The righteous are even greater once they have left the world than they are once they are in the world. So what is the idea of death? Death is, the Kotzker Rebbe said, death is simply moving home. It's simply moving from one place to another. He says what the intelligent person tries to do is make sure that they move to a nicer home. Right? That's our task and our responsibility, is to make sure that the home that we're building in Olam Haba is a good home. But we're not dying, we're not leaving. There's no real such thing as death. In fact, Rav Kook goes so far as to say that what we think of as death is actually an intensification of life. The soul is no longer bound to and limited to the confines of the body, but now is much free, and as we saw with the righteous, greater. But the lie of death is that it seems so very clear and so very convincing that the person is in fact not here anymore, that this is in fact their end. And so, this explains, he says, why death is linked to impurity. What's the impurity? The impurity, he says, is the lie. The impurity is the illusion. We live in a world which is full of illusions, and death is one of the illusions, and that's what creates the impurity. The Rabbi Jonathan Sachs a while ago said that the impurity of death, one of the lessons we must take from it is that Judaism does not worship death. Now, that's true, but I think this is a much, much deeper way of looking at it, is that the impurity of death is that it's not true. The impurity of death is that there's actually no such thing as human death. And what's that got to do with the Kohanim? It says the Kohanim have a higher level and a sacred task of the responsibility to always remember the eternality of the soul, to focus on the eternality of the soul, of the immortality of the human being, Olam Haba, the world to come, the world of truth as it's called. If he has that responsibility, he therefore has an obligation to withhold himself from too much contact with the deceased. Because if he is exposed to the lie too much, it's harder to keep in mind the hidden truth that death is not the end. And therefore the Kohen has to hold himself back from this from this kind of exposure, so that he'll always remember truly that that death is not in fact the end. And this is the danger that we find people have who interact with the deceased too much, even when it's a great mitzvah, even the Chevra Kadisha, people who do Tahara, who selflessly and thanklessly give of their time and devote themselves to caring for the deceased. The danger that they have is that it's easy to start to believe it. It's easy to start to think the person is actually gone. In Kabbalah, they speak about avoiding the cemetery. In fact, that it's something that one shouldn't go to the cemetery overly much. Now, I can't give you real insight and depth, and certainly I'm not saying anything practically. But perhaps a part of it is the same idea. Perhaps the idea is that even though we are not Kohanim, except for those of us who are, even though I'm not a Kohen, it still is a good idea, when there's no concrete, tangible benefit, to limit ourselves from contact with the deceased, when it's a funeral, when it's mourning, when you are able to help escort somebody to their final resting place, then you're fulfilling a great mitzvah. But when there's no particular mitzvah involved, but it's just something that you would be, you would be doing for emotional reasons, then perhaps it's not such a good thing, because perhaps what it reinforces for you is that this person is gone, is that this person is in the ground. It's not true. The person is not gone. The person is not in the ground. The analogy that I heard once is that of a caterpillar and a butterfly. Right? Imagine you had somebody who's only able to see caterpillars and not able to see butterflies. So he sees the caterpillar going to its chrysalis, and he sees that the caterpillar is gone. The body of the caterpillar is dead. And so he thinks the caterpillar is over. The truth is, there's a butterfly. It's a more transcendent form that has now arisen. If he wasn't able to see that, he would think that the caterpillar's died. And when we don't want somebody to believe this, so you have to limit their exposure. So I think that's a marvelous explanation for this aspect of the holiness of the Kohanim, as the custodians for the spirituality of the nation, as those responsible for making sure that we always reinforce our faith in Hashem and Olam Haba and the immortality of the soul. They must not do themselves a disservice by exposing themselves overly much to death, to the illusion of death, and to the weakening of faith in the truth that can come about as a result. Shabbat Shalom.